Joining us for today's program is Caribbean Director and Engineering Program Manager from Climate Resilient Housing, Miss Louise Foulkes. Good afternoon, Miss Foulkes, and thank you for joining us for Topical today.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me.
It is a pleasure to have you. Now let us get right into our discussion. Can you explain for us what climate resilient housing means and why exactly is it important?
Yes, so climate resilient housing, I think, is a big term, and we have a big definition for it. It's got to be housing that's disaster resistant. It needs to be healthy and secure. It needs to be affordable. It needs to be a financial asset, something you can pass down to your children, something you can leverage loans against. It needs to be sustainable, so it's built or strengthened through processes that can be scaled and replicated with minimal environmental footprint. It needs to be locally appropriate and built using materials and skills that are appropriate for culture and the climate. And then when we talk about not just the house itself, but housing in general, it needs to be adaptable and scalable.
So, Prime Minister Andrew Holness recently announced plans to promote climate resilient housing. How does your entity's approach align with the goals of the government?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, congratulations to Jamaica and to what the Prime Minister has announced. I think these are some great steps towards climate resilient housing. And I think Bill Change's approach is well aligned with what you're doing. A kind of a few thoughts on how we're aligned. We share a focus on strengthening the most vulnerable households. So both the households that are most physically vulnerable, they're in the worst condition, and also households with the highest socioeconomic vulnerability, kind of reaching the poorest people. I think that Jamaica's focus also on strengthening roofs for hurricanes is a key aspect of climate resilient housing that we share. And then finally, I saw that part of the work the Prime Minister is doing in Jamaica is looking at actually repairing houses, not just building new. And this is something that Bill Change does a lot. We do a lot of repair and retrofitting. So not just returning to the existing condition, but better than the existing condition, simply because it's often cheaper to retrofit rather than build new.
So, in terms of your entity, what materials and or techniques do you use to ensure that homes can withstand extreme weather events?
So Bill Change works throughout the Caribbean and across the world. So we work in many different contexts with many different materials and techniques and construction systems. And what we try and do in each place is to really focus on improving what already exists. We're not so much focused on bringing new technology to a place, kind of completely new construction systems. What we do is look at what's existing, look at how people are building, and then look at what needs to be changed, if anything, with that to make it climate resistant.
How do climate resilient homes differ from traditional homes in terms of design and construction?
Yeah, so I think that climate resilient homes won't necessarily look any different from the outside to traditional homes or non-resilient homes. By that I mean that a climate resilient home, it doesn't have to look like a completely different type of construction. It doesn't have to be a 3D printed house or something completely outside of what you know for it to be resilient. At Build Change, we talk a lot about the three C's for resilient housing. So these are configuration, connection, and construction quality. So a climate resilient house will have good configuration, the walls will be well placed, the roof will be well designed and proportioned, and then the connections, everything will be well tied together. The construction quality, the design, the build, the materials will all be of good quality. All these things will be present in a resilient home, but you might not necessarily see that from the outside.
So, Prime Minister Andrew Holness would have emphasized a need for hurricane resistant roofs. Could you discuss the importance of roofing in climate resilient housing?
Yeah, and I mean, this is something I completely agree with the Prime Minister on. Cannot stress enough the importance of roofs in hurricane-prone countries like Jamaica, like throughout the Caribbean region. I mean, my experience of working post-hurricane in multiple countries in the region is that the highest damage is often seen in roofs. And this is because construction practice really needs to change. And that's starting, but it needs to continue. Uh, the wind pressures that are seen on roofs are extremely, extremely high. And roofs really need to be designed and built to withstand this. I think, walls, foundations are generally well built. And so often what I've seen working post disaster is that walls remain standing completely unaffected almost, but the roof is gone. So this is where the greatest change and the greatest focus, I believe, is needed.
So, in terms of risk assessment, how do you guys assess the risk of natural disasters in a particular area in order to design homes accordingly?
So we use whatever hazard mapping data is available, as well as the national building codes. If that data is not available nationally or locally, we'll complement with regional or international research codes and standards to fill those gaps. What we often also will do is carry out site-specific evaluations. So our engineers will go to the site, carry out ground investigations, and then we'll talk to the communities and the homeowners that live there to understand their past experience with particularly flooding and landslides, to see how these hazards have affected the area. Because often there isn't data and mapping available at the kind of site level for flooding and landslide hazards, but people know when people live in an area, they know when it floods, they know if it's prone to landslides and what's happened in the past. So we find that talking to people is a really great way to complement the available data.
So, how then do you balance the need for climate resilience with affordability and accessibility in housing?
Yeah, good question. I think everybody always thinks that climate resilient housing is going to be more expensive. And often it is, but not significantly, and often it actually isn't. So we try to balance that as much as possible through a number of different ways. First of all, we try not to build new. We actually try to work with existing housing to repair and retrofit what already exists. We found that retrofitting a house costs just 23% of what it would cost to build a new climate resilient house. So it's significantly cheaper. We also work very closely with housing policymakers and financial specialists to make sure that governments have policy for resilient housing and that they offer subsidies, grants, tax breaks, whatever financial incentives they can to make resilient housing more affordable to people. We also work with lending institutions to create affordable home strengthening products. And then finally, so we're registered as a nonprofit, and this status makes us eligible to apply to international funding streams on behalf of governments or with governments to support the technical assistance that they need for housing resilient programs.
So, as the Jamaican government aims to reduce the risk of damage from these different natural disasters, what role do you think climate resilient housing will play in achieving this goal?
I think it will play a huge role. So the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure has a fantastic open source tool called GIRI that allows you to estimate losses in the building sector. So the value of housing that's exposed to hazards in Jamaica is over 33 billion US dollars. So I think that's around over 5 trillion Jamaican dollars. And that's about 64% of the total exposed value of all buildings and infrastructure. So just looking at the value of housing in Jamaica and what could potentially be lost in the next hurricane or earthquake or other hazard, it's huge. So if we can make that housing more resilient so that there will not be as high losses in that sector, it will have a huge impact on recovering post-disaster. I think also at a more kind of human level, if people still have a home after a hurricane, after an earthquake, they can return to work much faster. They can return their children to school much faster, their home life will be much more stable. And so just in terms of both economic productivity and also communities' wellness and happiness will be a much faster recovery if housing is secured.
Are there any specific challenges or obstacles that you faced when promoting and building these climate resilient houses?
Yes, I'm sure anyone working in this sector will say there's many challenges. I think, to keep talking about the money, we often find that funding available, particularly international funding available, is really skewed towards responding after a disaster. We do a lot of work preventatively before disaster, so strengthening homes before the hurricane, so that you don't need to come in post-disaster. But it's much harder to get the funding for this, so we'd love to see that changed. I think, as I've kind of hinted at as we've been discussing, housing is really a nexus of many different things. It's where policymakers and planners meet with engineers and architects and technical professionals. The building sector meets with the banks and the insurers and the financial sector. And so it would be great to have more of this discussion between all of those different parties and everybody coming together to focus together on making housing more resilient.
All right, so we're wrapping up now, so I'm going to ask my final question. As the demand for climate resilient housing continues to grow, what do you see as the future for this type of housing, and how do you envision that your entity will contribute to this effort?
I think the demand is growing because the risk is growing with climate change, and also because people's awareness is growing. Homeowners' awareness is growing of these risks. Because events, particularly hurricanes and floods with climate change, they're becoming more frequent, more severe. People are becoming more aware of these risks. And I think this is only going to continue. I hope and I do believe that both public and private sectors are recognizing this, and they will invest more in policy, finance, and technology for resilient housing. And us at Build Change, we will only continue to grow and support homeowners, communities, and governments in making their housing more resilient.
All right, thank you so much, Ms. Foulkes, for coming to speak to us about climate resilient housing.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And it was our pleasure to have you also. Thank you so much once again. Listeners, that was Caribbean Director and Engineering Program Manager from Climate Resilient Housing, Miss Louise Foulkes. Now we asked and you answered. It is now time for your responses on today's social media feedback question.